Hey there everyone. Today I'd like to discuss Roland Barthes' 1967 essay, The Death of the Author. This is one of the most important essays in modern literary criticism because it really changes the way we approach interpreting a text. Now, Barthes is confounded by the fact that typically when we read a text, we're trying to recreate the historical situation and mentality of the author. We're trying to get back to the author, back to the authenticity of the author, and we're trying to use this, for example, to figure out what does he or she really mean. And this notion of really meaning something has been, of course, criticized by many theorists, especially Derrida, for example. And Barthes is very concerned with our ability to even reconstruct the author because he sees the author, with a capital A, as a projected effect, something that we create post hoc in order to explain the meaning of the text, instead of, for example, realizing the fragmentary nature of every text and every person, and that the author does not have some privileged position even in interpreting their own work. Because we tend to defer to things like authorial intention whenever an interpretive question is in doubt, because it seems like a firm foundation, that if anything, it should mean what the author originally intended it to. But Barthes is seriously going to challenge this in this essay because he wants to focus more on the text as being something readerly than it is something writerly. Barthes begins by mentioning a quote from Balzac in which the speaker is a little bit ambiguous, and in asking who the speaker is, he wonders, well, for example, is it the author's perspective? Is it some omniscient perspective on the philosophy of womanhood or on identity or this specific character's subconscious? And he says, well, we can't really know. He says writing is the destruction of every voice, of every point of origin. Writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away, the negative where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body of writing. So instead of thinking about a text as some cohesive whole which is ruled over by the author or by a particular perspective which represents the author, instead we want to think of writing as, yes, a way which we can communicate with each other. But precisely when we enter this writing space, we dissimulate the possibility of absolute meaning. And in fact, really, we're always doing this, but especially in writing and reading, we have to realize that our subject, in order to be enunciated, must slip away. And the implications of this essay are very vast because, for example, this plays a lot on what it means to have an authentic history. Oftentimes, we think of history as merely a tabulation and collection of facts, that it's a sort of bullet-pointed list about things that can be known either beyond a reasonable doubt or for sure, for all intents and purposes. Of course, we can never be, a priori deductively true about history. It's always inductive and based on preponderance of evidence. But nevertheless, we like to think that we can just list facts. But this has changed a lot in the contemporary period, especially if we think about journalism, for example, where the way in which you construct a narrative is equally as important as the content of that narrative. Because the terms you use, the adjectives, the turns of phrases that you use in order to make that into a package is taking fragmentary events of an incomplete history and simulating the effect of it being a complete narrative. And in fact, this is something that we do all the time with identity, even with ourselves. We take various parts of what it means to be us, and we form this self-identity. Now, in fact, this self-identity is never complete. We're always trying to find ourselves. Every single one of us will die trying to find ourselves. And two, we will do that with the author. He says, as soon as a fact is narrated, no longer within a view to acting directly on reality, but intransitively, that is to say, finally outside of any function other than that of the very practice of the symbol itself, this disconnection occurs. The voice loses its origin. The author enters into its own death. Writing begins. In other words, to write is to move beyond just giving a lay of the land of facts in front of me. In some sense, it's to transcend those facts through the practice of writing, which means the death of this specific situation of being the author at this point in time. Because, of course, people can interpret your work however you want, whether or not you like it. And one can ask, why ought one defer to this author's voice, especially if the perception of that voice is always only partial? Whenever we're trying to reconstruct what an author feels, or what they think, we can get this to varying extents, but oftentimes it's unclear whether or not the content being expressed and the sentiments being expressed by characters are ones that the author shares or merely ones in which he's just trying to authentically represent a position. And as such, he thinks that we should get rid of this authorial deferring. That instead of thinking about the text as something stemming from the author, it's something which should stem from the internal dynamics of language itself. That we can understand what a text means just by looking at the structural relation of the parts, in a sense. He writes that it is language which speaks, not the author. To write is through a prerequisite in personality, not at all to be confused with the castrating objective of the realist novelist. To reach that point where only language acts, performs, and not me. Right? In order to create some work of art that can genuinely connect one to other people, one must go beyond oneself. One must task oneself to essentially be destroyed in the practice of writing. And as such, you have this performative image, this projection of the author, which allows he or she to enter into the textual medium. And by doing that, one's language now does and bears the brunt of the burden, not some personality of the author itself. No, it's whatever that is simulated as in the text. And he's careful to point out that, for example, language is a system that is filled with traces and codes and norms and whatnot. And that these codes, they can't be destroyed, only played off, as he says. Which means both that codes only exist through their play, through appearing a certain way, and also that codes can be moved beyond only obliquely, only by figuring out the dynamics by which those codes make sense. For example, the notion of rationality, or the real, or truth, or criminality. Any of these concepts, right, that we can kind of break them apart and figure out how they work internal to a system, and thus we can dissimulate the supposed omniscience of the author. Because think about when you're reading kind of a traditional realist novel, and the author says, so-and-so looked languidly, and then another character could tell in his mind that they were feeling such and such a way. You have insight into the character's unconscious and conscious thoughts, and you have very precise descriptors saying exactly the manner in which they're saying things. You're clarifying intention and the actual substance of what's being said through this omniscient perspective, through an authorial perspective, which is essentially above the plot. But Barthes points out that this is not how life works. When we live in events, and to really read is to read in the text, not beyond the text, and not to be able to try to seek recourse to the authorial perspective. He says, the whole of the Enunciation is an empty process, functioning perfectly without there being any need for it to be filled with the person of the interlocutors. Linguistically, the author is never more than the instance writing, just as I is nothing other than the instance saying I. Language knows a subject, not a person, and this subject, empty outside of the very enunciation which defines it, suffices to make language hold together. Suffices, that is to say, to exhaust it. So in order for sense to be made out of any work of literature, one must have some presumed subject, which is going to be the reader subject. And the reader, in some sense, is going to be subject to the norms and the ideals of the author, but also is going to be subject to the appearance of the author through the apparent coherence of the enunciation. And in fact, the author, as capital A author, only stems from its projected appearance, viz. Enunciation. Because that's what the text is doing. The text enunciates ideas, and the reader, too, brings those ideas to life. As such, the reader is really the one that is carrying the ability to exhaust the text through interpretation. Otherwise, the text is just dead. The author can do all he wants to put something on a page, but if no one reads it, then it doesn't do anything, right? He writes that the author, when believed in, is always conceived of as the past of his own book. Book and author stand automatically on a single line divided into a before and an after. The author is thought to nourish the book, which is to say that he exists before it, thinks, suffers, lives for it, is in the same relation of antecedence to his work as a father to his child. In complete contrast, the modern scriptor is born simultaneously with the text, is in no way equipped with a being preceding or exceeding the writing, is not the subject with the book as predicate. There is no other time than that of the enunciation of every text is eternally written here and now. The fact is, or it follows at least, that writing can no longer designate an operation of recording, notation, representation, depiction, as the classics would say. Rather, it designates exactly what linguistics, referring to Oxford philosophy, call a performative, a rare verbal form exclusively given in the first person and in the present tense, in which the enunciation has no other content, contains no other proposition than the act by which it is uttered. Something like the I declare of kings, or the I sing of very ancient poets. Having buried the author, the modern scriptor can thus no longer believe, as according to the pathetic view of his predecessors, that his hand is too slow for his thought or passion, and that consequently, making a law of necessity, he must emphasize this delay and indefinitely polish his form. For him, on the contrary, the hand, cut off from any voice, born by a pure gesture of inscription and not of expression, traces a field without origin, or which at least has no other origin than language itself, language which ceaselessly calls into question all origins. In other words, the process of writing itself calls into question the origin of the authorial perspective, because the presumption is that the author stands before his text, that he plans out his text, that everything is intentional in the text and as the author would want it. But anyone who knows anything about some of the more self-critical artists, oftentimes intentionality creates a big problem, because oftentimes authors will put something down and they can't match their intentions to what they're writing. In fact, we never can, because our intentions are always going to be alienated from themselves in the act of writing, whereby they become objectified and become an object for the viewing of the reader. Thus, the very existence of the author, and this is different from the human that is the author, it is specifically the omniscient authorial perspective that is supposed to give an authentic narration of the facts of this imaginary world, exists only as a performative, which is to say something which is the act of its very utterance. It is constituted by, and its truth is the fact that it utters itself. The author exists only insofar as he can have his appearance enunciated, performed, and projected into and through the text. Therefore, Barthes says, we know now that a text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author God, but a multidimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them equal, blend and clash. The text is a tissue of quotations drawn from the innumerable centers of culture. And a great example of a text that actually brings this out is James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, where if you go into any of the secondary literature talking about the creation of Finnegan's Wake, you'll see the very intense note-taking process that Joyce used in order to take stuff from his everyday life and jot it down in a notebook in a way that was often purposefully unclear, such that when he came back to it, he would have a new perspective on it. He would be a different James Joyce, responding to himself in the past, which is thus no longer himself in a certain sense. And this dialectic and this fragmentation and fissure within the author himself is an instance of this blending and clashing that Barthes is mentioning. Since the text is a multidimensional space through its signification and through the actual existence in space and time of the person who is writing, both of these come together to show that the text is fundamentally a space of contestation. The writer, as Barthes says, can only imitate a gesture that is always anterior, never original. His only power is to mix writings, to counter the ones with the others, in such a way as never to rest on any one of them. Did he wish to express himself, he ought at least to know that the inner thing he thinks to translate is itself only a ready-formed dictionary, its words only explainable through other words, and so on indefinitely. And this is one of the points that Derrida mentions. Signification can only be explained through a prior or an antecedent signification. In other words, what a word really means requires the architecture of other words to help support what it means to signify a certain thing, what it means to be able to form sentences in which certain signifiers stand in relation to one another. Thus, for the author to express himself is really to take advantage of a pre-given sense, of meaning, of what it means to articulate oneself and reify oneself or eternalize oneself as a writer through the act of writing. As such, the writer is always trying to play catch-up with the meanings he really intends. He's always behind his meanings and can never get in front of them to fully explain them. This is even confirmed in, for example, Gödel's incompleteness theorem in mathematics, where we know that no system can be non-circularly justified in all of its axioms. There must always be some axioms or assumptions made by the system that cannot be grounded in a non-circular way. Language is a perfect example of this. In order to make the meaning out of any utterance or word, you must have a access to what that word means, how it's used. And babies, for example, or young children, when they're learning language and they're hearing people around them, are just taking all these things together and establishing patterns, but not a priori patterns. They're just establishing rates of correspondence between different things such that they can simulate the fullness of the English language, which in fact they're always behind and they're always catching up to. They're always learning. As such, Barthes says that life never does more than imitate the book, and the book itself is only a tissue of signs, an imitation that is lost, indefinitely and infinitely deferred. Right? The actual text, what is really meant, is always deferred forwards. We can always do further interpretation. And this is kind of a signpost of what it means to be in this postmodernist school of interpretation, is that you're always going to have an indefinite amount of interpretation to do moving forward. You can always add a further perspective. And this shows, in fact, that the signs that constitute the text itself are nothing but a number of perspectives on themselves. He says to give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text, to furnish it with a final signified, to close the writing. Such a conception suits criticism very well, the latter then allotting itself the important task of discovering the author, or its hypostases, society, history, psyche, liberty, etc., beneath the work. When the author has been found, the text is explained, quote unquote, victory to the critic. So the problem with treating texts as being primarily reducible to authorial intention and the existence of the writer at all as seen through the text is essentially a way of suiting texts and meaning to an academic discourse that focuses on texts as a series of problems to be solved. Instead, if we think about the author as a question, a self-directed question, a self-integration, an interrogation of oneself as one writes, then we understand the unfolding process by which, for example, an author develops over the course of their text, and in fact may retrogress over the course of their text, may succumb to certain ideas they didn't at the beginning of the work, or vice versa. As such, we have a very new look at what it means to be a writer and to be a reader, such that, as he says, in the multiplicity of writing, everything is to be disentangled, nothing deciphered. The structure can be followed, run like the thread of a stocking, at every point and at every level, but there's nothing beneath. The space of writing is to be ranged over, not pierced. Writing ceaselessly posits meaning ceaselessly to evaporate it, carrying out a systematic exemption of meaning. In precisely this way, literature, it would be better from now on to say writing, by refusing to assign a secret, an ultimate meaning to the text and to the world as text, liberates what may be called an anti-theological activity. An activity that is truly revolutionary, since the refuse to fix meaning is, in the end, to refuse God and his hypostases, reason, science, law. So we're profoundly undermining the rationalist ideal that seeks, for example, a correspondence theory of truth in the text. That we have some designed world which is rationally constructed according to certain laws of, things like character arcs and development and plot structure. Instead of thinking about these things as pre-given molds, which are then planned out and put into the text, instead we undermine that, which essentially has been put onto the author post hoc by critics who want to understand the text as something they can give a final statement on. Instead, we constantly have this process whereby we are constantly deferring meaning, and yet we are trying to disentangle various signifiers from one another. Therefore, and this really applies to something like Finnegan's Wake, a text is made of multiple writings, drawn from many cultures and entering into mutual relations of dialogue, parody, contestation. But there is one place where this multiplicity is focused, and that place is the reader, not, as was hitherto said, the author. The reader is the space on which all the quotations that make up a writing are inscribed without any of them being lost. A text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. Yet this destination cannot any longer be personal. The reader is without history, biography, psychology. He is simply that someone who holds together in a single field all the traces by which the written text is constituted. In other words, by reifying the meaning of the text through the act of reading, we are, at least according to Barthes, an empty subject who merely allows the text to be sprawled out, to be reified through our reading capacities. By doing that, we have the ability to set up a system of signifiers and the relation with one another using our pre-given logics. As such, Barthes concludes, the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. In other words, to have true interpretation in any real sense, we must get rid of the omniscient narrator perspective, the author with a capital A, and instead focus on the practice of reading and the contestation of meaning through interpretation. That being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat helpful. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because I'd appreciate anything that you have to give, but no pressure whatsoever. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.